Health and Human Services Secretary takes it a step further. I want to play this for you and then get your reaction. Watch.
I think that it's time to say to those folks, it's fine if you don't choose to get vaccinated. You may not come to work. You may not have access to a situation where you're going to put my grandchildren in jeopardy. Freedom is one thing, but freedom when you harm others, like secondhand smoke and issues that we've dealt with very clearly in the past. You can't drive drunk. I want to take off my mask. I want to be able to live my life with vaccination. And right now, I'm being impinged on by people who say, I don't want to get vaccinated.
Now, she likens it to smoking and secondhand smoke on places where you cannot smoke. You can't drive drunk. That is illegal. Does she have a point? What is your response to that?
You know, I think there's a lot of people on the Democrat side who have an authoritarian impulse. They have no concern for individual liberty or freedom. But also her analogy doesn't work. If she's been vaccinated, she's not at risk. She says she's worried about her grandkids who haven't been vaccinated. Her grandkids have a greater risk of being struck by lightning than they do of dying from COVID. The seasonal flu is actually more dangerous for children than COVID is. Now, the reverse is for the elderly. I'm not saying it's not dangerous for the elderly. COVID's quite dangerous for the elderly, but it's not dangerous at all for children. And the thing is that many of the children have had it. These authoritarians like this woman would just soon force your kid to have a shot and a vaccine without knowing whether your child has already had COVID. We need to study whether or not those who have already had COVID, when you give them a vaccine, whether there's a higher incidence of side effects from people who've already had it. We know that if you've already had COVID and then get vaccinated, your response to the vaccine is 1,000 times greater because your body has already been immunized by the disease. So these are questions we should ask, and in a free society, you should be free to decide. It might be that you have an in-between position. You know, your kid's 15 years old and you're thinking about it, but you want to know, well, my kid was sick 2 months ago and everybody seemed to have COVID. 2 of his friends had COVID. He seemed to have had it. Why don't I test him for antibodies, and then I'll make my decision whether I want to be vaccinated. But for the school system or for workers to say you can't come to work, even though you've already had the disease and you have just as much immunity as someone who's vaccinated, how unfair is that and how unscientific is it?
But that's my point that I wanted to get to with you, because there are millions of Americans that have recovered from COVID-19. They have natural immunity. We're on track with the vaccine distribution. We can cite how many people have been vaccinated, but we never talk about natural immunity. We never talk about the millions of Americans that have gotten COVID. I ask this question all the time, and let me tell you the response I always get is, case in point, we do not know how long the immunity will last. Senator rather, do you know how long the vaccine, immunity from the vaccine will last?
That's exactly my response, because reporters in the halls of Congress have been saying this to me for a year and a half now, that I don't know how long my natural immunity will last. And my response to them is, you don't know how long your vaccine immunity will last. Doesn't mean the vaccine's bad or that natural immunity doesn't work. It just means we don't know. But the thing is we've had the studies on natural immunity for longer. The vaccine we've had for about 6 months, but we have people now that have been infected a year and a half out. And all of the studies, including studies from the 2004 SARS, which was another coronavirus, show long-lasting immunity. There are people 17 years later that still have immunity to SARS. All of the studies so far are encouraging that you will have long-lasting immunity. But the thing is, it still gets down to choice. You can look at the studies, you can decide for yourself, but there's ample evidence to say that you do have immunity, and it's not a small amount of people. 34 million people have tested positive, but when you do an antibody survey to see who was positive that never got a test, you find 2 more for every one that tested positive. So that's about 100 million people who had it naturally, and they have immunity, and to discount this is incredibly unfair to say, oh, you can't come to work or you can't go to school, even though you've already had it. There's no science behind that. It's anti-science, but they don't want to be troubled with it. Everybody's going to be treated like, you know, part of the beehive. It's a collective, and we're not going to think about anybody individually. This is what the authoritarians say. So the new authoritarians are on the left, and there's a bit of irony because they seem to complain all the time about how somehow Donald Trump was going to destroy democracy and bring on authoritarianism, and yet the new authoritarians really seem to be mostly on the left.
Let's talk really quickly before you go about either voter integrity or voter suppression. Depends on what side of this coin you're on. President Biden here calling on Americans to band together to protect the right to vote, reject Republican-led efforts to change election laws. Let's play this for you and I'll get your reaction.
The assault on free and fair elections is just such a threat, literally. I've said it before. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War.
That's not the first time that he's used that reference since the Civil War. Your reaction?
He's delusional. The thing is if you look at voting statistics over the last several decades, African Americans actually are now voting at a higher percentage than white Americans in Mississippi and Alabama and most of the southern states where there was admittedly a real problem in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 1960s. Now when you look at statistics, African Americans vote equal to or greater than white voters as a percentage. So that's good news. We should all be, resoundingly cheering because of that news. Instead, he's telling you some kind of drivel that's delusional and untrue. And in trying to feed fear where there doesn't need to be fear, we need to have honest elections, and showing up with your ID has nothing to do with Jim Crow. It was the Democrat Party that needs to apologize for Jim Crow, but it has nothing to do with restricting the right to vote. The Georgia law actually, as well as the Kentucky law, actually extends and expands the ability to vote.
Yeah, a lot of folks, if you read it, it's quite plain literature there, if you will. Before you go, I've got to ask you about this as you being in the Senate. $3.5 trillion, possibly going to go through reconciliation. Your thoughts on the Senate Democrats continue to push this so-called infrastructure bill through? Do you think that it gets through? What have you heard?